I'm in favor of, figuring out a way to get some additional resources for sort of civilian staff to kind of handle some of that back end paperwork. In terms of finding more sworn officers, that's bigger than a money question, much bigger.
Do you think hiring more sworn officers would help to reduce crime or not?
I do not.
Okay.
Not on a large scale. I mean, to the extent that, if we added more program or more, NETS officers or something like that, but, if we staged an officer at every corner, then people would just rob the houses in the middle of the blocks. If you're taking a deterrent approach, which is, if you're hiring officers to just have a presence, you're trying to deter people. And that's just going to create a vicious cycle of, oh, well, we need more. And then people don't feel safe. No one wants to have to walk by or drive by, an officer patrolling and, making them feel like they're a criminal in their own neighborhood. I think it's much better. Sergeant Harris, I love the way that he approaches kind of police work with, let's go in and make friends and, try to mitigate all the problems. And I think, the other way that the city has done a good job is through code enforcement, our neighborhood services division, by making it less comfortable for people who might otherwise be inclined to make criminal choices to do so.
Okay. Other questions from the board? Otherwise, I will change topics or move on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about flooding and how to deal with that. Obviously, you guys have heard from HR Green. I'd kind of like to get an idea from you how you think the city should go about doing this. Obviously, it has a pretty big price tag.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that most of the projects on this list are worth doing and that the city could afford them?
I think that's a very big question. I don't have very strong personal feelings one way or the other about, having a big flood wall I guess I'd rather not have a big flood wall because I don't think that that's just strategically the right way to go. But I think that you really have to look at the data and the return on investment. And, if you're spending $5 million to protect $50 million worth of economic assets, it's probably worth it. If you're spending $5 million to protect $1 million worth of economic assets, maybe you should start looking at more creative solutions.
Well, and I guess what I'm trying to understand from you is, as you've looked at these lists of projects and the potential costs and knowing what you do about what we have in these areas, do these projects look like they're worth pursuing? And are they worth substantial city investment? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, the how do you do that part is
I realize that's tougher.
Yeah, well, it's like anything, you have to plan out your priorities and then segment out your budget. We have a starting base of, if it's capital projects, especially, it kind of makes it easier. I think this is something I've criticized my opponent about is, the confluence of, capital versus operational. You make it a priority based on, you have the whole council rank, do we want to do flood projects? And it's built into the system of how we do budgeting of, what is the council in general's biggest priority. Now, a lot of my residents are obviously, well, all of my residents are obviously not on the riverfront. So there's not quite as much, I don't get a lot of comments from constituents about, riverfront. If anything, I get complaints about, well, why are you spending money on 3rd and 4th? So I don't rank those projects necessarily terribly high, but I'm also not opposed to them because I do understand that they, that the areas that are potentially being protected that's being driven by the fact that they are economic engines.
Sure. Okay. All right.
What about folks on the west end though? Just regular folks who don't have a big investment downtown. It's just their house. Do they not deserve the same amount of flood protection?
Well, so I think you're talking about like the Garden Edition where Rick is a representative. Yeah, so I don't represent them personally, but that is a very complicated question, because it's not, well, we don't care about you. It's that, we have to make decisions about, overall priorities for the city. So I have asked, the administration to look at kind of alternate ways that we can relieve some of the negative effects of flooding, on the houses in the Garden Edition. But that's just a really sticky question with not a good answer, because those houses should not have been built there in the first place. So how do we clean up that mess without draining resources that could be used to invest all around? And I don't know, to be honest. That's a question where I'm still looking for an answer for.
Okay. Let me ask you about affordable housing. The housing cluster is identified tens of thousands of units short in the Quad City area as a whole. Why hasn't the city taken a more aggressive stand towards luring more affordable housing, incenting more affordable housing to be built in this city?
Yeah, well, and I think there's been tension related to Davenport feeling that it's being expected to take on more than its fair share within the Quad Cities. Davenport and
Do you feel that way?
I think that we can do it in a way that is not necessarily like, so one of the things that I pushed for was like the 657A law. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but not necessarily using the straight low income monetary incentives, but things like the Dream Project, and trying to work on our abandoned properties, get those back into the hands of people who are going to do something with them. I don't think it necessarily needs to be a copy of a federal or a state program for low income housing, because those already exist. And it's kind of like the same thing with, crime and social services, is that if we spread our pot of money trying to do everybody's job, then we're not doing ours. And so I prefer that the city focus its resources on the things that only the city can do, such as 657A, Dream Project, and actually wrote my grad thesis about this. There were many iterations of things before.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that code, the code section that you were referring to. What does that provide for or specify?
So this is actually something that Marion McGinnis and Tom Warner worked on like decades ago, where the city can say, like, hey, you property owner, you aren't taking care of your property. You're not doing anything with, you're just sitting on it while it rots. We're gonna take the deed if you're not gonna be responsive. And then the idea is not to hold the deed. We don't want to be doing maintenance for a bunch of properties. It's to get the deed to somebody who can turn it into most likely a rental, or, for ownership would be great, but that's a little more complicated. I know the 180 zone has done a couple of those now, I think. I'd have to dig up the details to get that to you.
That sounds like a fairly arduous process for what is likely to be very little return.
But that's those things where it builds.
And I'm trying to remember the number that the housing cluster put on it, but given that Davenport is the largest city in the Quad Cities and likely is the site of most of that deficit, isn't it incumbent upon the city to do maybe more than, say, the city of Bettendorf?
I was not under the impression that we are the source of the deficit.
No? Okay.
But I could be misinformed here, but in terms of proportion of affordable housing availability, that Davenport is doing well in respects to other cities in the Quad Cities.
I guess what I was thinking about was in terms of those who might qualify, given that Davenport generally has a higher share of its population that are low income. It's likely that the people who would benefit from affordable housing are disproportionately in Davenport. I mean, I guess that's what I was getting at.
Wouldn't they benefit from having affordable housing all around the Quad Cities, though?
I suppose they would, but it looks like under that sort of role of thinking, nobody's going to move.
Well, which is unfortunate. I'm not opposed to Davenport doing more. I just don't. I don't necessarily think that. I think that there is quite a bit of finger pointing at Davenport because that's where people currently reside. There's obviously the situation like with Crestwood and things that the saying you guys solve this problem by yourselves doesn't seem like everybody's quite playing as a team.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I've heard that complaint over the years that other cities just don't want to chip in.
Yeah,
but it seems if that type of attitude continues, not a lot gets done, right?
correct. Which is why we did we've done the things that we did with. The heritage money was one thing. The ARPA funding, I can't remember how much of that was designated towards housing off the top of my head. But it's one of many goals, I would say.
How much city investment should there be in redeveloping North Park Mall? The mayor's talked about that as a goal, and the city's taken some minor steps toward that. I guess I'm curious how much of a priority that is for you.
I think it's kind of in its early stages right now, so it's hard to give like a hard number. But the future of malls, not just North Park, but malls like that all across the country, we have a real opportunity. And so I think that if some project does come along that's very promising to take that from a site that is struggling for air, let's call it, into an economic hub, that it would be worth looking into whatever tax incentives or crazy economic tools they come up with to make that happen. And I think that we're so early in the infancy of what that looks like that we don't even know what that will be. Probably some form of housing is what I would guess. But I think that at least as the city right now, we should be focused on steering that site, because if we just kind of say, well, the free market will figure it out, the free market will not figure it out in a way that we are happy with.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about the state of city streets. How would you assess the condition of city streets?
We have not made up the deficit that has built up over decades.
Okay.
But do you think that that the city is putting forward, I guess, adequate investment to chip away at that and make progress?
To make progress, yes. To make progress as quickly as people would like, no. Which, it's always a question of, if we put an extra 5 million into it, we would make a lot faster progress, but then, that 5 million comes from sewers or something else. And so I do think that the new prioritization of neighborhood streets is a step in the right direction. That for a long time it was, well, we've got the arterials, why are you guys complaining? And that now we're actually seeing, okay, like people want to not, lose a tire in a pothole, on their roads, as they're getting like on the final part to their house.
Okay.
Hey, Maria, what do you say though to folks who, because I've heard this around town for weeks now that the council made a mistake when it took $6 or $7 million to build a playground and didn't spend it on something like it's not going to happen without that kind of
Well,
level
yes,
of
that's really quite a misnomer. Because it's a whole area, and I think actually it was Alderman Condon that made a comment about this, that people hated the Eiffel Tower when it was built, and people hated the Sky Bridge when it was built, but it ends up being something that really draws people to the area. I know they still hate it sometimes, but a lot of people like it, and
I think the Eiffel Tower is probably more popular than the Sky Bridge.
Hey, we're Davenport, not Paris. I'm sorry, I don't speak French.
I guess what I'm trying to get at though is how do you as a council, as an alder person, what are you using as criteria to determine how to tip those scales in a funding situation?
It's very case by case. This was something where a lot of people came together and said, we think that this is a worthy investment. And it wasn't just driven by any particular one set of individuals. It was the partnership. I'm trying to remember there was 3 main stakeholder groups. But this was something that a lot of people came together and said, we see this as being the thing that draws people to downtown Davenport when something else wouldn't. I'm excited to bring my kids there hopefully someday, but I do think it's true that something that you can't see anywhere else is going to draw people in a lot more than $6 million for 1 year on streets will just fizzle. $6 million sounds like a ton of money, especially to someone who's not familiar with city budgets. But we could spend all of that money on streets and you maybe notice a little bit. Whereas we spend that money on the playground and people will gripe for a couple of years. But then, you're going to have families moving to Davenport because they say, well, I saw this thing and I heard about how cool Davenport was, and now I want to live here. And you can even see that with the apartment market downtown. The rents are high, so I've heard.
We're getting close on time, but I wanted to ask you, how do you think the city administrator is doing?
I've generally been very satisfied with her work. Sometimes I do get a little frustrated with her not having a lot of flexibility, but I also have to respect that she has a lot of experience that I don't have. And so, I might push her on, hey, I think this is a really good idea. But I also want to be respectful as a member of a 10-person board that says, well, I like this idea, but I also respect that you've got this data that says, well, that's not going to work out like you think it is. So I'll move on to another idea and present it to her and probably get that one shot down. But, 100 times later, I'll find something that works.
Well, as Matt says, we are getting close to our half hour. Anybody else got any other questions? If not, I'll let you wrap up. Anybody?
Yeah, I have one quick question. I wanted to ask you about something that you posted on your Facebook page related to your opponent. You posted that I'm not going to lose to someone who stood in shit-stained pants. And I'm wondering, do you think that's appropriate, that's appropriate language for an alderwoman to be using?
I think that we police what public officials look and act like, and that's to a great disservice. I think that public officials are real humans too. And that it's my passion for the city that, makes me want to keep getting up there and fighting the hard fights and going through the gruel.
Does that set a good example though, as a 1 of 10 alderman?
Well, I mean, I think that, yes, honestly, I think that being honest with what we think is a great example.
Very good. We have reached the end of our, unless you had another follow-up, Tom, or anything like that. We've reached the end, and we'll let you take the last couple minutes to sum up and tell us why we should endorse you.
Well, currently sitting on 6 years of experience. I'm very passionate about having Davenport continue to be a place that I want to live. You know, I have young kids, and the whole, you know, reason I got involved in public life was that I wanted to make the city into something that they would want to come back to after they came, you know, hopefully go off to some sort of, you know, postgraduate work or post high school work. And I hope that I can continue that. I think that there's a lot of experience that I bring, but it hasn't necessarily drained me of ideas. It's just steered me in a more focused direction.
Very good. Well, we wish you well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, everybody.